Hello, hello. Welcome to Storytime with Moog. I am Moog. But first, reading updates. So I did go to the library today and I picked up, I told you I'm obsessed with this. I told you. Blue Lock, Volume 4. I picked it up today and I may or may not have already finished it. I mean, it's a manga. It doesn't take that long, but I can't stop. Can't stop, won't stop. I'm still reading parts that I already know because of the anime, but it's just so good. It's so good. I enjoy it. The like drama and the intensity. Just pretend that was fine. Um, is just so much. It's just so much. Everything is stressful, but like not for us, but like for them because they are trying to be like the Japan's best striker. Okay, so the basic story is that there are 200 of the best high school strikers or like forward players in Japan that have been selected, and they are now living and competing for the chance to be on Japan's national team. If they lose, which 299 of them will, they are contractually not allowed ever to play for Japan's team. So the stakes are really high because a lot of people, like, this is their outlet, this is their life, this is what they want to do. And you get close to well, we're focusing on one team, but we're getting close to these 11 characters and their reason for being there and why it is so important for them to be the number one striker in Japan. And it's just so good. It's so good. There's betrayal, there's drama, there's just, I don't know, soccer. It's great. It's great. There is a mention here that I was gonna quote on Twitter, but I don't remember what it is. Oh, here it is. I found it. I just think it's really cool, and I'm probably still gonna put it up on Twitter, but it says, "The monster inside me is saying, when things look dire, don't get scared. Get excited." And it's like, ooh. You're like, yes, they are just playing a game. Yes, they are just teens, but when you're teens, everything is more exciting, you know? And then I'm also continuing with Wayward by Amelia Hart. I am reading this because it won for best debut author and best historical fiction for 2023. I am more than halfway through and I'm enjoying it so far. It is 3 timelines, 3 different women. We have I always forget the timelines. We have 2019 Kate, and has just left her very abusive boyfriend. We have 1619 Alpha, who is being charged. Well, we don't know if she's being charged, but she was accused and on trial for being a witch. And then 1942, we have Violet, who is just not wanting to fall in line of what a proper lady should be doing. And each of them have very close ties to their natural surroundings around them. And it's pretty interesting. And I like it. I like it. I like it. So that's what I'm reading right now. Okay, so I said short stories and then I come with this massive chunker, but it is an anthology. So I have like 3 of these. I got them when I was in undergrad for American literature. And this is the Norton Anthology of American Literature. And this edition specifically is for 1865 to 1914. So we're covered. We're covered. I think I have 3 total of these anthologies, but I think the other ones are like more recent. So let's do it. Okay. 1850 to 1904. All right. Catherine O'Flaherty seemed more likely as a young woman to become a consumer of literature than a producer of it. Her Irish immigrant father was a successful businessman who died in a train wreck when his daughter was 4 years old. The family enjoyed a high place in St. Louis society, and her mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother were active, pious Catholics in French heritage. Without doubt, Kate O'Flaherty grew up on the company of loving, intelligent, independent women. Particularly important was her strong-willed great-grandmother, a compelling and tireless storyteller whose influence may have been central to Chopin's becoming a significant regional writer and the author of a remarkable novel, The Awakening, 1899, that speaks radically to issues of gender, sexuality, and the American family. Chopin was 9 years old before she entered St. Louis Academy of the Sacred Heart, but she was already well read in English and French authors, and by the time she graduated from the Academy in 1868, she had absorbed Cervantes, Dante, Goethe, and many English novelists and poets of the 18th and 19th centuries, Austen and Brontes, and Coleridge among them. But it was French writers who most strongly influenced her sense of life and her craft as a writer. She read and admired French classical authors as well as more contemporary figures such as Gustave Flaubert, Madame de Staël, but it was Émile Zola and Guy de Maupassant who provided philosophical perspective and fictional method when she began to write in earnest in her late 30s. What she said of Maupassant was she might have said of herself. Here is a man who had escaped from tradition and authority, who had entered into himself and looked out upon life through his own being and with his own eyes, and who in a direct and simple way told us what he saw. Though Chopin is sometimes praised for his symbolic, imagistic prose, there we go, she was able to see and to narrate a new reality indeed. What she saw, whether in St. Louis, New Orleans, or the Louisiana countryside, was the tension between individual erotic inclination and the constraints placed on desire, especially on women's sexual desire, by traditional social norms. What she told directly and without moral judgment was how certain women were beginning to challenge the patriarchal rules that sought not only to confine them to well-defined social, economic, and vocational domains, but to control their inner life as well. Her new, modern perspectives, especially on female sexuality, paralleled those of Edith Wharton and Theodore Dreiser. At the age of 19, she married Oscar Chopin and spent the next decade in New Orleans, where her husband first prospered, then failed, in the cotton business. After a few years in Cloyerville, a village in northwest Louisiana near Natchitoches, where her husband opened a general store and managed a family cotton plantation. She returned to St. Louis permanently in 1884, a year after her husband's death from swamp fever, probably malaria. A year later, her mother died, and at the age of 35, Chopin was left essentially alone to raise her 6 young children. Having recognized the ready market for local color or regional fiction, Chopin decided to fashion a literary career out of her experience of the Creole and Cajun cultures she had come to know. Chopin had the gift of equanimity and wrote on a lapboard in the midst of a busy household. Many of her stories were written in a single day. She claimed that she wrote on impulse, that she was completely at the mercy of unconscious selection of subject, and that the polishing up process always proved disastrous. This method, although it ensured freshness and sincerity, made some of her stories anecdotal or thin. Though a score of the best of them have endured, it is remarkable that in the relatively few years of her writing career, scarcely more than a decade, she completed 3 novels, more than 150 stories and sketches, and a substantial body of poetry, reviews, and criticism. A first novel, At Fault, was published in 1890, but it was her stories of Louisiana rural life, especially in the collections Bayou Folk, 1894, that won her national recognition as a practitioner of local color fiction. She made the Catholic Creoles and Cajuns, with their old-fashioned European customs, their polyglot, witty speech, their sensuous and seemingly unself-conscious lives, and their rich agricultural landscape in picturesque parish familiar to Americans, as Sarah Orne Jewett was making known the severe Protestant towns of rocky coastal Maine. A second collection of stories, A Night in Acadie, was published 3 years later and increased her reputation as a local colorist. Nina Bayham has argued persuasively that local color writing, which flourished after the Civil War, was in part the product of anxiety over the loss of the familiar in a period of rapid change and dislocation, literal and figurative, nostalgia for more stable times, and the emergence of a homogenized national society. The trauma of America's most destructive war up until that time made antebellum America seem like a golden age to many. Yet Chopin does not idealize the Old South. To the contrary, she often presents it from a critical or oppositional view, especially as concerns gender and race. Chopin managed to be recognized as a regionalist while subtly critiquing Southern values, in many ways anticipating the early Faulkner. Chopin was skilled in the depiction of characters and advancement of plot through distinctive dialogue. She was able to create with great economy a believable physical world in which climate, cultural, community, and individual personalities exist in subtle reciprocal relations. Sexuality is often a part of the scene. What Chopin notices and portrays in such undercurrents challenged conventional limits in fiction. In her explicit and unapologetic eroticism, as in The Storm, 1898, I didn't realize it was going to be a steamy story. Oops. It was not so much that adultery is committed under the steamiest of conditions, but that in the end no one is left feeling guilty or unhappy. That almost certainly kept Chopin from submitting the story for publication. In any event, it was not published until 1969 as part of Per Seyersted's edition of The Complete Works of Kate Chopin. Chopin's major work, The Awakening, influenced by Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary, 1856, was published in 1899. The novel, which traces the sensual and sexual coming of consciousness of a young woman, predictably aroused hostility among contemporary reviewers, such as Whitman's Leaves of Grass, which Chopin admired and half a century later. The New Woman, demanding social, economic, and political equity, was already a common topic of public discussion and subject of fiction. But the depiction of such an unrepentant, if ultimately deeply psychologically confused, sensualist as Edna Pontellier was more than many of the critics of the time could allow to pass. The book was called Trite and Sordid, essentially vulgar, and unhealthy retrospective and morbid in feeling. Chopin was dropped from her St. Louis clubs and snubbed by friends. But in objecting to Edna's behavior, these readers missed what is more disturbing about The Awakening. Chopin presented nothing less than a wasteland for women in her generation, describing not only Edna's desire for individual freedom, but also the naturalistic forces that made her quest futile. It should have been Chopin's essential pessimism and not her racy scenes that unnerved the critics. Though some commentators found much to praise in The Awakening, Chopin's only published response to her reviewers was to claim, tongue-in-cheek, "I never dreamed of Mrs. Pontellier making such a mess of things and working out her own damnation as she did. If I had had the slightest intimation of such a thing, I would have excluded her from the company." After the book was published, Chopin's health began to deteriorate, and she wrote little. Though the novel and its author fell into obscurity for half a century since the 1970s, and particularly since the publication of the Norton Critical Edition, which helped bring Chopin into the canon, they have now secured an honored place in American history, in American literary history. Wharton and Chopin were among the first women authors after Emily Dickinson to be added to many American literature syllabi. In recent years, critics have begun to explore the intricacies of race, class, and ethnicities as subjects and contexts in this remarkable novel that once was thought to be only, or at least primarily, aimed at exploring Edna's sexuality. In The Awakening, more impressively because of the grander scale than in her shorter fiction, Chopin demonstrates her unusual capacity to make the exotic worlds of New Orleans and the Louisiana Gulf Coast real, and to fill those worlds with complex and often baffled men and women, not unlike T.S. Eliot's Prufrock, whose humanity she confirms by refusing to judge them or use them to support a thesis. Some critics have accordingly found the novel's feminist argument to be complicated by the fatal weakness of Edna's psyche. The notes to The Awakening printed here owe much to the second Norton Critical Edition, edited by Margot Cully. The Storm. The leaves were so still that even Bibi thought it was going to rain. Bobineau was so accustomed to converse on terms of perfect equality with his little son, called the child's attention to certain somber clouds that were rolling with sinister intentions from the west, accompanied by a sullen, threatening roar. They were at Friedheimer's store, and decided to remain there till the storm had passed. They sat within the door on 2 empty kegs. Bibi was 4 years old, and looked very wise. "Mama'll be afraid, yes?" he suggested, with blinking eyes. "She'll shut the house. Maybe she got Sylvie helping her this evening." Bibineau responded reassuringly. "No, she ain't got Sylvie. Sylvie was helping her yesterday," pipped Bibi. Bibineau arose and, going across to the counter, purchased a can of shrimps, of which Calixta was very fond. When he returned to his perch on the keg and sat stolidly holding the can of shrimps while the storm burst. It shook the wooden store and seemed to be ripping furrows in the distant field. Bibi laid his hand on his father's knee and was not afraid. 2. Calixta, at home, felt no easiness for their safety. She sat at a side window, sewing furiously on a sewing machine. She was greatly occupied and did not notice the approaching storm. But she felt very warm, and often stopped to mop her face, on which the perspiration gathered in beads. She unfastened her white sack at her throat. It began to grow dark, and suddenly realizing the situation, she got up hurriedly and went about closing windows and doors. Out on the small front gallery, she had hung Bibineau's Sunday clothes to dry, and she hastened out to gather them before the rain fell. As she stepped outside, Alice Rabiniere rode in at the gate. She had not seen him very often since her marriage, and never alone. She stood there with Bobineau's coat in her hand, and the big raindrops began to fall. Alcée rode his horse under the shelter of the side projection where the chickens had huddled, and there were plows and a harrow piled up in the corner. "May I come in and wait on your gallery till the storm is over, Calixta?" he asked. "Come long in, Monsieur Alcée." His voice and her own startled her, as if from a trance, and she seized Bobineau's vest. Alcée, mounting to the porch, grabbed the trousers and snatched Bibi's braided jacket that was about to be carried away by a sudden gust of wind. He expressed an intention to remain outside, but it was soon apparent that he might as well have been out in the open. The water beat in upon the boards in driving sheets, and he went inside, closing the door after him. It was even necessary to put something beneath the door to keep the water out. My, what a rain! It's good 2 years since it rained like that, exclaimed Calixta, as she rolled up a piece of bagging, and Alcée helped her to thrust it beneath the crack. She was a little fuller of figure than 5 years before when she married, but she had lost nothing of her vivacity. Her blue eyes still retained their melting quality, and her yellow hair, dishevelled by the wind and rain, kinked more stubbornly than ever about her ears and temples. The rain beat upon the low, shingled roof with a force and clatter that threatened to break an entrance and deluge from there. They were in the dining room, the sitting room, the general utility room. Adjoining was her bedroom, with Bibi's couch alongside her own. The door stood open, and the room with its white, monumental bed, its closed shutters, looked dim and mysterious. Alcée flung himself into a rocker, and Calixta nervously began to gather up from the floor the lengths of a cotton sheet which she had been sewing. "If this keep up, do say, if the levee's going to stand it," she exclaimed. "There's a note right there, and it says, 'Built up earth banks designed to keep the river from flooding and surrounded land.' Do say? God knows. There we go. What have you got to do with the levees?" I got not, I got enough to do. And there's Bibino and Bibi out in the storm. If he only didn't left Freidheimers. Let us hope, Calixta, that Bobiner's got sense enough to come in out of the cyclone." She went and stood at the window with a greatly disturbed look on her face. She wiped the frame that was clouded with moisture. It was stifling hot. Alcée got up and joined her at the window, looking over her shoulder. The rain was coming down in sheets, obscuring the view of far-off cabins and enveloping the distant wood in a gray mist. The playing of the lightning was incessant. A bolt struck a tall chinaberry tree at the edge of the field. It filled all visible space with a blinding glare, and the crash seemed to invade the very boards that stood upon. Calixta put her hands to her eyes, and with a cry staggered backwards. Alcée's arm encircled her, and for an instant he drew her close and spasmodically to him. "Monte!" she cried, releasing herself from the encircling arms and retreating from the window. "This house'll go next, if I only knew where Bibi was." She could not compose herself. She would not be seated. Alcée clasped her shoulders and looked into her face. The contact of her warm, palpitating body, when he had unthinkingly drawn her into his arms, had aroused all the old-time infatuation and desire for her flesh. "Calixta," he said, "don't be frightened. Nothing can happen. The house is too low to be struck, with so many tall trees standing about. There. Aren't you going to be quiet? Say, aren't you?" He pushed her hair back from her face, that was warm and steaming. Her lips were as red and moist as pomegranate seeds. Her white neck and a glimpse of her full, firm bosom disturbed him powerfully. As she glanced up at him, the fear in her liquid blue eyes had given place to a drowsy gleam that unconsciously betrayed a sensuous desire. He looked down into her eyes, and there was nothing for him to do but to gather her lips in a kiss. It reminded him of Assumption. There's a note right there after Assumption, and it says, "Assumption Parish, Louisiana, the setting for At the Acadian Ball," which happens before this. "Do you remember in Assumption, Calixta?" he asked in a low voice, broken by passion. Oh, she remembered. For in Assumption he had kissed her, and kissed her, until his senses would well nigh fail, and to save her he would resort to a desperate flight. If she was not an immaculate dove in those days, she was still inviolate, a passionate creature whose very defenselessness had made her defense, against which his honor forbade him to prevail. Now, Now, her lips seemed in a manner freer to be tasted as well as her round, white throat. They did not heed the crashing torrents, and the roar of the elements made her laugh as she lay in his arms. She was a revelation in that dim, mysterious chamber, as white as the couch she lay upon. Her firm, elastic flesh that was knowing for the first time its birthright, was like a creamy lily that the sun invites to contribute its breath and perfume to the undying life of the world. The generous abundance of her passion, without guile or trickery, was like a white flame which penetrated and found response in depths of his own sensuous nature that had never yet been reached. When he touched her, they gave themselves in a quivering ecstasy, inviting his lips. Her mouth was a fountain of delight, and when he possessed her, they seemed to swoon together at the very borderland of life's mysteries. He stay cushioned upon her, breathless, dazed, enervated, and his heart beating like a hammer upon her. With one hand she clasped his head, her lips lightly touching his forehead. The other hand stroked with a soothing rhythm his muscular shoulders. The growl of the thunder was distant and passing away. The rain beat softly upon the shingles, inviting them to drowsiness and sleep, but they dared not yield. 3. The rain was over, and the sun was turning the glistening green world into a palace of gems. Calixta, on the gallery, watched Alcée ride away. He turned and smiled at her with a beaming face, and she lifted her pretty chin in the air and laughed aloud. Oh, I skipped a page. Babineau and Bibi trudged home, stopped without at the cistern to make themselves presentable. My Bibi, what will your mamma say? You ought to be ashamed. You ought to put on those good pants. Look at 'em. And that mud on your collar. How you got that mud on your collar, Bibi? I never saw such a boy. Bibi was the picture of pathetic resignation. Babineau was the embodiment of serious solicitude as he strove to remove from his own person and his sons the sign of their tramp over heavy roads and through wet fields. He scraped the mud off Bibi's bare legs and feet with a stick, and carefully removed all traces from his heavy brogans. Then, prepared for the worst, the meeting with an over-scrupulous housewife, they entered cautiously at the back door. Calixta was preparing supper. She had set the table and was dripping coffee at the hearth. She sprang up as they came in. "Oh, Babineau, you're back!" "My, but I was uneasy. Where you been during the rain? And Bibi, he ain't wet? He ain't hurt?" She had clasped Bibi and was kissing him effusively. Babineau's explanations and apologies, which he had been composing all along the way, died on his lips as Calixta felt him to see if he were dry, and seemed to express nothing but satisfaction at their safe return. "I brought you some shrimps, Calixta," offered Babineau, hauling the can from his ample side pocket and laying it on the table. "Shrimps! Oh, Babineau, you are too good for anything." And she gave him a smacking kiss on the cheek that resounding. It's French, I'm sorry. There is a translation, and I'm just gonna say that. I promise you. But imagine that I said it in French and it was perfect. "We'll have a feast tonight." Babineau and Bibi began to relax and enjoy themselves, and when the three seated themselves at the table, they laughed much, and so loud that anyone might have heard them as far away as La Bonniere's. 4. Alcée Labonnière wrote to his wife, Clarisse, that night. It was a loving letter full of tender solicitude. He told her not to hurry back, but if she and the babies liked it at Biloxi, to stay a month longer. He was getting on nicely, and though he missed them, he was willing to bear the separation a while longer, realizing that their health and pleasure were the first things to be considered. 5. As for Clarice, she was charmed upon receiving her husband's letter. She and the babies were doing well. The society was agreeable. Many of her old friends and acquaintances were at the Bay, and the first free breath since her marriage seemed to restore the pleasant liberty of her maiden days. Devoted as she was to her husband, their intimate conjugal life was something which she was more than willing to forego for a while. So the storm passed, and everyone was happy. The end. Okay. Steamy. Okay, so let's read about her first. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, 1868 to 1935. Charlotte Perkins Gilman lived her life, for the most part, on the margins of a society whose economic assumptions about and social definitions of women she vigorously repudiated. Out of this resistance to conventional values and what she later characterized as masculinist ideals, Gilman produced the large body of polemical writings and what we would call today self-consciously feminist fiction that made her the leading theoretician, speaker, and writer on women's issues of her time. Charlotte Ann Perkins was born in Hartford, Connecticut on July 3, 1860. Her father, Frederick Beecher Perkins, was a minor literary figure, grandson of the theologian Lyman Beecher, and nephew of the preacher Henry Ward Beecher, and of Harriet Beecher Stowe. Interesting. I didn't realize there was that connection. That's kind of cool. Her mother was Mary A. Finch, whose family had lived in Rhode Island since the middle of the 17th century. Gilman's father deserted his family and left for San Francisco shortly after her birth, and she spent many years trying, without success, to establish some intimacy with him. She received from him only occasional letters with lists of books she should read. Her mother returned to Providence, Rhode Island, where she supported herself and her 2 children with great difficulty. She withheld from them all physical expressions of love, hoping to prevent their later disillusionment over broken relationships. It is easy to understand why in her autobiography Gilman describes her childhood as painful and lonely. Between 1880 and her marriage in May 1884 to Charles Stetson, a promising Providence artist, Gilman supported herself in Providence as a governess, art teacher, and designer of greeting cards. During those years, she had increasingly become aware of the injustices inflicted on women, and she had begun to write poems, one in defense of prostitutes, in which she developed her own views on women's rights. She entered into the marriage reluctantly, anticipating the difficulties of reconciling her ambitions to be a writer with the demands of being a wife, housekeeper, and mother. Within 11 months, their only child, Catherine, was born. Following the birth, Gilman became increasingly despondent, and marital tensions increased. Her husband and her mother were convinced that Gilman needed rest and willpower to overcome her depression. They persuaded her to go to Philadelphia for treatment by Dr. S. Weir Mitchell, the most famous American neurologist of the day. A specialist in women's nervous disorders, Mitchell usually prescribed a rest cure consisting of total bed rest for several weeks and limited intellectual activity thereafter. In those days, postpartum depression was not widely understood. As Gilman put it in Why I Wrote the Yellow Wallpaper, published in 1913, the doctor sent me home after 6 weeks with the solemn advice to live as domestic a life as possible, to have but 2 hours of intellectual life a day, and never to touch pen, brush, or pencil again, as long as I lived. The patient returned to Providence and obeyed these instructions for 3 months, and came so near the borderline of utter mental ruin that I could see over. She drew back from the edge of madness by resuming her life as a reluctant wife and mother, and as an enthusiastic writer and frequent contributor to the Boston Women's Journal. A few years later, she wrote her most famous story, as she concluded, "I was not intended to drive people crazy, but to save people from being driven crazy," and it worked. Writing The Yellow Wallpaper, 1892, however, did not keep Gilman from suffering all her life with extended periods of depression. In 1888, after a trial separation, convinced that her marriage threatened her sanity, Gilman moved with her daughter to Pasadena, California, and in 1892 was granted a divorce. Her former husband promptly married her best friend, the writer Grace Ellery Channing, and not long thereafter Gilman sent her daughter east to live with them. Such actions generated much publicity and hostile criticism in the press, but nothing kept Gilman from pursuing her double career as a writer and lecturer on women, labor, and social organization. In these years, she was particularly influenced by the sociologist Lester Ward and the utopian novelist Edward Bellamy. In 1898, Gilman published Women and Economics, the book that earned her immediate celebrity, and that is still considered her most important nonfiction work. This powerful feminist manifesto argues a thesis Gilman was to develop and refine for the rest of her life. Women's economic despondency on men stunts not only the growth of women, but that the whole human species. More particularly, she argued that because of the despondency of women on men for food and shelter, the sexual and maternal aspects of their personality had been developed excessively and to the detriment of their other productive capacities. To free women to develop in a more balanced and socially constructive way, Gilman urged such reforms as centralized nurseries and professionally staffed collective kitchens. In 1911, she published The Man-Made World, which contrasted the competitiveness and aggressiveness of men with the cooperativeness and nurturance of women, and posited that until women played a larger part in national and international life, social injustice and war would characterize industrialized societies. In the same year, her short story, Turned, appeared, taking on similar gender issues. Similarly, in His Religion and Hers, 1923, Gilman predicted that only when women influenced theology would the fear of death, punishment cease to be central to religious institutions and practices. Gilman's poetry and fiction, most written when she was well past 40, must be seen, as the critic Anne J. Lane has observed, as part of her ideological worldview, and therein lies its interest and power. Therein also lie its limits. For as Lane also says, she wrote quickly, carelessly, to make a point. Still, many of Gilman's stories and her utopian novels, such as Moving the Mountains, Herland, and With Her in Our Land, offer vivid dramatizations of social ills and their potential remedies that result from a competitive economic system in which women are subordinate to men and accept their subordination. In Herland, for instance, Gilman offers a vision of an all-female society in which caring women raised children, reproduced by parthenogenesis, collectively in a world that is both prosperous and ecologically sound. In 1900, after a long courtship, she married her first cousin, George Houghton Gilman. They lived together happily, first in New York, then in Norwich, Connecticut, until he died suddenly in 1934. Gilman then moved to Pasadena to live with her daughter's family. The next year, suffering from breast cancer and convinced that her productive life was over, she committed suicide with chloroform she had long been accumulating. All right. What is it with people marrying their first cousins? That seems to just, have been a thing. Okay, so why I wrote The Yellow Wallpaper. Many and many a reader has asked that. When the story first came out in the New England magazine about 1891, a Boston physician made protest in the transcript. There is a note after 1891, and it says the correct date is January 1892. Such a story ought not to be written, he said. It was enough to drive anyone mad to read it. Another physician, in Kansas, I think, wrote to say that it was the best description of incipient insanity he had ever seen, and, begging my pardon, had I been there. Now the story of the story is this. For many years I suffered from a severe and continuous nervous breakdown tending to melancholia and beyond. During about the 3rd year of this trouble I went, in devout faith and some faint stir of hope, to a noted specialist in nervous disease, the best known in the country. This wise man put me to bed and applied the rest cure, to which a still good physique responded so promptly that he concluded there was nothing much to the matter with me, and sent me home with solemn advice to live as domestic a life as far as possible, to have but 2 hours intellectual life a day, and never to touch pen, brush, or pencil again as long as I lived. This was in 1887. I went home and obeyed those directions for some 3 months, and came so near the borderline of utter mental ruin that I could see over. Then, using the remnants of intelligence that remained, and helped by a wise friend, I cast the noted specialist's advice to the winds, and went to work again. Work, the normal life of every human being. Work, in which is joy and growth and service, without which one is a pauper and a parasite, ultimately recovering some measure of power. Being naturally moved to rejoicing by this narrow escape, I wrote the yellow wallpaper, with its embellishments and additions to carry out the ideal. I never had hallucinations or objections to my mural decorations, and sent a copy to the physician who so nearly drove me mad. He never acknowledged it. The little book is valued by alienists, and as a good specimen of one kind of literature. It has, to my knowledge, saved one woman from a similar fate, so terrifying her family that they let her out into normal activity, and she recovered. But the best result is this. Many years later I was told that the greatest specialists had admitted to friends of his that he had altered his treatment of neurasthenia since reading the yellow wallpaper. It was not intended to drive people crazy, but to save people from being driven crazy. And it worked. That's just cool. That's cool that, like, the work of fiction actually saved people's lives, and the way that it was treated was changed. That's just really cool. Okay. Read a little poem here. To the Indifferent Women. You who are happy in 1,000 homes, or overworked therein to a dumb peace, whose souls are wholly centered in the life of that small group you personally love, who told you that you need not know or care about the sin and sorrow of the world. Do you believe the sorrow of the world does not concern you in your own little home? That you are licensed to avoid the care and toil for human progress, human peace, and the enlargement of our power of love, until it covers every field of life. The one first duty of all human life is to promote the progress of the world, in righteousness, in wisdom, truth, and love, and you ignore it, hidden in your homes, content to keep them in uncertain peace, content to leave all else without your care. Yet you are mothers, and a mother's care is the first step towards friendly human life. Life where all nations is untroubled peace, unite to raise the standard of the world, and to make the happiness we seek in homes spread everywhere in strong and fruitful love. You are content to keep that mighty love in its first steps forever, the crude care of animals for mate and young and homes, instead of pouring it abroad in life, its mighty current feeding all the world, till every human child shall grow in peace. You cannot keep your small domestic peace, your little pool of undeveloped love, while the neglected, starved, unmothered world struggles and fights for lack of mother's care, and its tempestuous, bitter, broken life beats in upon you in your selfish homes. We all may have our homes in joy and peace, when women's life, in its rich power of love, is joined with man's to care for all the world. 1911. She walketh veiled and sleeping. She walketh veiled and sleeping, for she knoweth not her power. She obeyeth but the pleading of her heart, and the high leading of her soul unto this hour. Slow advancing, halting, creeping, comes the woman to the hour. She walketh veiled and sleeping, for she knoweth not her power. Also 1911. Okay. Let's do one more story. This is called Turned. In her soft carpeted, thick curtained, richly furnished chamber, Mrs. Mariner lay sobbing on the wide, soft bed. She sobbed bitterly, chokingly, despairingly. Her shoulders heaved and shook convulsively. Her hands were tight clenched. She had forgotten her elaborate dress, the more elaborate bed cover, forgotten her dignity, her self-control, her pride. In her mind was an overwhelming, unbelievable horror, an immeasurable loss, a turbulent, struggling mass of emotion. In her reserved, superior, Boston-bred life, she had never dreamed that it would be possible for her to feel so many things at once, and with such trampling intensity. She tried to cool her feelings into thoughts, to stiffen them into words, to control herself, and could not. It brought vaguely to her mind an awful moment in the breakers at York Beach, one summer in girlhood, when she had been swimming under water and could not find the top. In her uncarpeted, thick, thin curtained, poorly furnished chamber on the top floor, Gerda Peterson lay sobbing on the narrow, hard bed. She was of larger frame than her mistress, grandly built and strong, but all her proud young womanhood was prostrate now, convulsed with agony, dissolved in tears. She did not try to console herself. She wept for two. If Mrs. Mariner suffered more from the wreck and ruin of a longer love, perhaps a deeper one, if her tastes were finer, her ideals loftier, if she bore the pangs of bitter jealousy and outraged pride, Greta had personal shame to meet, a hopeful future, and a looming present which filled her with unreasoning terror. She had come like a meek young goddess into that perfectly ordered house, strong, beautiful, full of goodwill and eager obedience, but ignorant and childish, a girl of 18. Mr. Mariner had frankly admired her, and so had his wife. They discussed her visible perfections and as visible limitations with that perfect confidence which they had so long enjoyed. Mrs. Mariner was not a jealous woman. She had never been jealous in her life, till now. Gerda had stayed and learned their ways. They had both been fond of her. Even the cook was fond of her. She was what is called willing, unusually teachable and plastic. And Mrs. Mariner, with her early habits of giving instruction, tried to educate her somewhat. I never saw anyone so docile, Mrs. Mariner had often commented. It is perfection in a servant, but almost a defect in character. She is so helpless and confiding. She was precisely that, a tall, rosy-cheeked baby, rich womanhood without, helpless infancy within. Her braided wealth of dead gold hair, her grave blue eyes, her mighty shoulders and long, firmly molded limbs seemed those of a primal earth spirit. But she was only an ignorant child, with a child's weakness. When Mr. Mariner had to go abroad for his firm, unwillingly, hating to leave his wife, he had told her he felt quite safe to leave her in Greta's hands. She would take care of her. Be good to your mistress, Gerda. Gerda. Her name's Gerda, not Greta. My little brain is swapping letters. Be good to your mistress, Gerda, he told the girl that last morning at breakfast. I leave her to you to care of. I shall be back in a month at latest. Then he turned smiling to his wife. And you must take care of Gerda, too, he said. I expect you'll have her ready for college when I get back. This was 7 months ago. Business had delayed him from week to week, from month to month. He wrote to his wife long, loving, frequent letters, deeply regretting the delay, explaining how necessary, how profitable it was, congratulating her on the wide resources she had, her well-filled, well-balanced mind, her many interests. If I should be eliminated from your scheme of things by any of those acts of God mentioned on the tickets, I do not feel that you would be an utter wreck, he said. That is very comforting to me. Your life is so rich and wide that no one loss, even a great one, would wholly cripple you. But nothing of the sort is likely to happen. I shall be home again in 3 weeks, if this thing gets settled. And you will be looking so lovely, with that eager light in your eyes, and the changing flush I know so well, and love so well. My dear wife, we shall have to have a new honeymoon. Other moons come every month. Why shouldn't the mellifluous kind? He often asked after little Gerda. Sometimes enclosed a picture postcard to her, joked his wife about her laborious efforts to educate the child, was loving and merry and wise. All this was racing through Mrs. Mariner's mind as she lay there, with the broad hem-stitched border of fine linen sheeting crushed and twisted in one hand, and the other holding a sodden handkerchief. She had tried to teach Gerda, and had grown to love the patient, sweet-natured child in spite of her dullness. At work with her hands she was clever, if not quick, and could keep small accounts from week to week. But to the woman who held a Ph.D., who had been on the faculty of a college, it was like baby tending. Perhaps having no babies of her own made her love the big child the more, though the years between them were but 15. To the girl she seemed quite old, of course, and her young heart was full of grateful affection for the patient care which made her feel so much at home in this new land. And then she had noticed a shadow on the girl's bright face. She looked nervous, anxious, worried. When the bell rang she seemed startled and would rush hurriedly to the door. Her peals of frank laughter no longer rose from the area gate as she stood talking with the always admiring tradesmen. Mrs. Mariner had labored long to teach her more reserve with men, and flattered herself that her words were at least effective. She suspected the girl of homesickness, which was denied. She suspected her of illness, which was denied also. At last she suspected her of something which could not be denied. For a long time she refused to believe it, waiting. Then she had to believe it, but schooled herself to patience and understanding. The poor child, she said. She is here without a mother. She is so foolish and yielding. I must not be too stern with her." And she tried to win the girl's confidence with wise, kind words. But Gerda had literally thrown herself at her feet and begged her with streaming tears not to turn her away. She would admit nothing, explain nothing, but frantically promised to work for Mrs. Mariner as long as she lived, if only she would keep her. Revolving the problem carefully in her mind, Mrs. Mariner thought she would keep her, at least for the present. She tried to repress her sense of ingratitude in one she had so sincerely tried to help, and the cold, contemptuous anger she had always felt for such weakness. "The thing to do now," she said to herself, "is to see her through this safely. The child's life should not be hurt any more than is unavoidable. I will ask Dr. Bleat about it. What a comfort a woman doctor is! I'll stand by the poor, foolish thing till it's over, and then get back to Sweden, somehow, with her baby. How they do come where they are not wanted, and don't come when they are wanted," said Mrs. Mariner, sitting alone in the quiet, spacious beauty of the house, almost envied Gerda. Then came the deluge. She had sent the girl out for needed air toward dark. The late mail came. She took it in herself. One letter for her husband's letter. She knew the postmark, the stamp, the kind of typewriting. She impulsively kissed it in the dim hall. No one would suspect Mrs. Mariner of kissing her husband's letter, but she did. Often. She looked over the others. One was for Gerda, and not from Sweden. It looked precisely like her own. It struck her a little odd, but Mr. Mariner had several times sent messages and cards to the girl. She laid the letter on the hall table and took hers to her room. "My poor child," it began. What letter of hers had been sad enough to warrant that? "I am deeply concerned at the news you send." What news to so concern him had she written? "You must bear it bravely, little girl. I shall be home soon, and will take care of you, of course. I hope there is not immediate anxiety. You do not say. Here is money in case you need it. I expect to get home in a month at latest. If you have to go, be sure to leave your address at my office. Cheer up. Be brave. I will take care of you." The letter was typewritten, which was not unusual. It was unsigned, which was unusual. It enclosed an American bill, $50. It did not seem in the least like any letter she had ever had from her husband, or any letter she could imagine him writing. But a strange, cold feeling was creeping over her, like a flood rising around a house. She utterly refused to admit the ideas which began to bob and push about outside her mind, and to force themselves in, yet, under the pressure of these repudiated thoughts, she went downstairs and brought up the other letter. The letter to Gerda. She laid them side by side on a smooth space on the table, marched to the piano and played with stern precision, refusing to think till the girl came back. When she came in, Mrs. Mariner rose quietly and came to the table. "Here is a letter for you," she said. The girl stepped forward eagerly, saw the two lying together, hesitated, and looked at her mistress. "Take yours, Gerda. Open it, please." The girl turned frightened eyes upon her. "I want you to read it here," said Mrs. Mariner. "Oh, ma'am, no. Please don't make me." "Why not?" There seemed to be no reason at hand, and Gerda flushed more deeply and opened her letter. It was long. It was evidently puzzling to her. It began, "My dear wife." She read it slowly. "Are you sure it is your letter?" asked Mrs. Mariner. "Is not this one yours? Is not that one mine?" She held out the other letter to her. It is a mistake, Mrs. Mariner went on with a hard quietness. She had lost her social bearings somehow, lost her usual keen sense of the proper thing to do. This was not life. This was a nightmare. Do you not see? Your letter was put in my envelope, and my letter was put in your envelope. Now we understand it. But poor Gerda had no antechamber to her mind, no trained forces to preserve other while agony entered. The thing swept over her, resistless, overwhelming. She cowered before the outraged wrath she expected, and from some hidden cavern that wrath arose and swept over her in pale flame. "Go and pack your trunk," said Mrs. Mariner. "You will leave my house tonight. Here is your money." She laid down the $50 bill. She put with it a month's wages. She had no shadow of pity for those anguished eyes, those tears which she heard drop to the floor. "Go to your room and pack," said Mrs. Mariner, and Gerda, always obedient, went. Then Mrs. Mariner went to hers, and spent a time she never counted, lying on her face on the bed. But the training of the 28 years which had elapsed before her marriage, the life at college, both as a student and teacher, the independent growth which she had made, formed a very different background for grief from that in Gerda's mind. After a while, Mrs. Mariner rose. She administered to herself a hot bath, a cold shower, a vigorous rubbing. "Now I can think," she said. First she regretted the sentence of instant banishment. She went upstairs to see if it had been carried out. Poor Gerda! The tempest of her agony had worked itself out at last as in a child, and left her sleeping, the pillow wet, the lips still grieving, a big sob shuddering itself off now and then. Mrs. Mariner stood and watched her, and as she watched, she considered the helpless sweetness of the face, the defenseless, unformed character, the docility and habit of obedience which made her so attractive, and so easily a victim. Also she thought of the mighty force which had swept over her, of the great process now working itself out through her, of how pitiful and futile seemed any resistance she might have made. She softly returned to her own room, made up a little fire, and sat by it, ignoring her feelings now, as she had before ignored her thoughts. Here were two women and a man. One woman was a wife, loving, trusting, affectionate. One was a servant, loving, trusting, affectionate. A young girl, in exile, a dependent, grateful for any kindness, untrained, uneducated, childish. She ought, of course, to have resisted temptation, but Mrs. Mariner was wise enough to know how difficult temptation is to recognize when it comes to the guise of friendship, and from a source one does not suspect. Gerda might have done better in resisting the grocer's clerk, had, indeed, with Mrs. Mariner's advice, resisted several. But where respect was due, how could she criticize? Where obedience was due, how could she refuse, with ignorance to hold her blinded until too late? As the older, wiser woman forced herself to understand and extenuate the girl's misdeed and foresee her ruined future, a new feeling arose in her heart, strong, clear, and overmastering. A sense of measureless condemnation for the man who had done this thing. He knew. He understood. He could fully foresee and measure the consequences of his act. He appreciated to the full the innocence, the ignorance, the grateful affection, the habitual docility of which he deliberately took advantage. Mrs. Mariner rose to icy peaks of intellectual apprehension. from which her hours of frantic pain seemed far indeed removed. He had done this thing under the same roof with her, his wife. He had not frankly loved the younger woman, broken with his wife, made a new marriage. That would have been heartbreak pure and simple. This was something else. That letter, that wretched, cold, carefully guarded, unsigned letter. That bill, far safer than a check. These did not speak of affection. Some men can love two women at once. This was not love. Mrs. Mariner's sense of pity and outrage for herself, the wife, now spread suddenly into a perception of pity and outrage for the girl. All that splendid, clean young beauty, the hope of a happy life, with marriage and motherhood, honorable independence even. These were nothing to that man. For his own pleasure he had chosen to rob her of her life's best joys. He would take care of her, said the letter. How? In what capacity? And then, sweeping over both her feelings for herself, the wife, and Gerda, his victim, came a new flood, which literally lifted her to her feet. She rose and walked, her head held high. This is the sin of man against woman, she said. The offense is against womanhood, against motherhood, against the child. She stopped. The child. His child. That, too, he sacrificed and injured, doomed to degradation. Mrs. Mariner came of stern New England stock. She was not a Calvinist, hardly a Unitarian, but the iron of Calvinism was in her soul, of that grim faith which held that most people had to be damned for the glory of God. Generations of ancestors who both preached and practiced stood behind her, people whose lives had been sternly molded to their highest moments of religious conviction. In sweeping bursts of feeling they achieved conviction, and afterward they lived and died according to that conviction. When Mr. Mariner reached home a few weeks later, following his letters, too soon to expect an answer to either, he saw no wife upon the pier, though he had cabled, and found the house closed darkly. He let himself in with his latchkey and stole softly upstairs to surprise his wife. No wife was there. He rang the bell. No servant answered it. He turned up light after light, searched the house from top to the bottom. It was utterly empty. The kitchen wore a clean, bald, unsympathetic aspect. He left it and slowly mounted the stair, completely dazed. The whole house was clean, in perfect order, wholly vacant. One thing he felt perfectly sure of. She knew. Yet, was he sure? He must not assume too much. She might have been ill. She might have died. He started to his feet. No, they would have cabled him. He sat down again. For any such change, if she had wanted him to know, she would have written. Perhaps she had, and he, returning so suddenly, had missed the letter. The thought was some comfort. It must be so. He turned to the telephone and again hesitated. If she had found out, if she had gone, utterly gone, without a word, should he announce it himself, to friends and family? He walked the floor. He searched everywhere for some letter, some word of explanation. Again and again he went to the telephone and always stopped. He could not bear to ask, "Do you know where my wife is?" The harmonious, beautiful rooms reminded him in a dumb, helpless way of her, like the remote smile on the face of the dead. He put out the lights, could not bear the darkness, turned them all on again. It was a long night. In the morning he went early to the office. In the accumulated mail was no letter from her. No one seemed to know of anything unusual. A friend asked after his wife. "Pretty glad to see you, I guess," he answered, evasively. About 11, a man came to see him. John Hill, her lawyer. Her cousin, too. Mr. Mariner had never liked him. He liked him less now, for Mr. Hill merely handed him a letter, remarked, "I was requested to deliver this to you personally," and departed, looking like a person who is called on to kill something offensive. I have gone. I will care for Gerda. Goodbye, Marion. That was all. There was no date, no address, no postmark, nothing but that. In his anxiety and distress, he had fairly forgotten Gerda and all that. Her name aroused in him a sense of rage. She had come between him and his wife. She had taken his wife from him. That was the way he felt. At first he said nothing, did nothing, lived on alone in his house, taking meals where he chose. When people asked him about his wife, he said she was traveling for her health. He would not have it in the newspapers. Then, as time passed, as no enlightenment came to him, he resolved not to bear it any longer, and employed detectives. They blamed him for not having put them on the track earlier, but set to work, urged to the utmost secrecy. What to him had been so blank a wall of mystery seemed not to embarrass them in the least. They made careful inquiries as to her past, found where she had studied, where taught, and on what lines, that she had some little money of her own, that her doctor was Josephine L. Bleat, M.D., and many other bits of information. As a result of careful and prolonged work, they finally told him that she had resumed teaching under one of her old professors, lived quietly, and apparently kept boarders, giving him town, street, and number, as if it were a matter of no difficulty whatsoever. He had returned in early spring. It was autumn before he found her. A quiet college town in the hills, a broad, shady street, a pleasant house standing in its own lawn, with trees and flowers about it. He had the address in his hand, and the number showed clear on the white gate. He walked up the straight gravel path and rang the bell. An elderly servant opened the door. Does Mrs. Mariner live here?" "No, sir." "This number is 28?
"Yes, sir."
"Who does live here?"
"Mrs. Wheeling, sir."
Ah, her maiden name. They had told him, but he had forgotten. He stepped inside. "I would like to see her," he said. He was ushered into a small parlor, cool and sweet, with the scent of flowers. The flowers she had always loved best. It almost brought tears to his eyes. All their years of happiness rose to his mind again, the exquisite beginnings, the days of eager longing before she was really his, the deep, still beauty of her love. Surely she would forgive him. She must forgive him. He would humble himself. He would tell her of his honest remorse, his absolute determination to be a different man. Through the wide doorway there came in to him 2 women, one like a tall Madonna bearing a baby in her arms. Marion, calm, steady, definitely impersonal. Nothing but a clear pallor to hint of inner stress. Gerda, holding the child as a bulwark, with a new intelligence in her face, and her blue, adoring eyes fixed on her friend, not upon him. He looked from one to the other dumbly, and the woman who had been his wife quietly asked,
What have you to say to us?
And that's where it ends. Okay, I liked that story. Ooh, I liked that one so good. Again, that was called Turned. It came out in 1911. Oh, that was good. I really liked it. Okay, so things that I love about it. I love that we get the roller coaster of emotions through Marion. She, is away from her husband and just loves him so, so much and like adores their servant. Like she's younger, she's going to keep her under her wing, like all of these things. Um, she herself is a professor, so she has no problem like bringing her worldly knowledge as well as like academic knowledge to help Gerda out. And her husband being away is just it's being continued. So he's staying longer and longer, weeks into months, all of these things. And she's getting letters from them, very lovely letters, all of these things. And one day we get a letter. Well, okay, we Marion knows that something is going on with Gerda, and Gerda keeps denying what it is. She's like, "Oh, like she's just, it's anxiety. Oh, she's just sick. Oh, wait, she's pregnant." But that's okay because we have a really good doctor. Well, I'm going to take care of her. Like all of these things. And then we get a two letters from the husband. One is to Marion and one is to Gerda. And he mixes up the envelopes. And so the one to Marion, to his wife, is very impersonal and just saying, "I'm going to come home soon and I'm going to take care of it. Don't you worry. Here's $50. Like, don't leave, blah, blah, blah." And then the letter that is for his wife but ends up going to Gerda is this pages long about how much he loves her and how much he misses her and all of these things, how his day is going. And so immediately Marion is like, "You need to leave. You need to leave my home and you need to leave my service. Here's the $50 that came with the letter that was supposed to be for you, and here's a month's pay. Go pack your things." And then as the night is going on, Marion's thoughts are just changing. She's mad at Gerda. She's mad at herself. But really, she's mad at her husband. She's mad at him because he's knowingly doing this. And it's not that, like, he doesn't want to be with Marion because he loves Gerda. It's not that, like, Marion is a late wife and now he has this new person that he's going to spend a new life with. There was no love in it. In the transaction, the money transaction, or in like their relationship. And so just so infuriated. And so Marion realizes like it's not Gerda's fault. Gerda has always been the person who is serving us, undoubtedly, unquestioningly. And so, of course, when your boss is asking for this, that's what Gerda knows. And so Marion leaves and takes Gerda with her and takes the kid with her. And they are taking care of each other. And the husband comes back and is just like, "Oh, my wife left. My wife died," like whatever the case. And he is just ignoring it for a while, thinking that she's just going to come back and just trying not to tell people what actually happened. And then he eventually hires detectives. They find her. He goes there. She's teaching, but under her like maiden name, and also has a house in this place with borders, all of these things. And he goes there, and the house is just filled with the flowers, her favorite flowers. And he's brought back to the early days of their relationship and how, much in love they were and are. And he's like, "I just know she is going to forgive me." But we don't know. Gerda and Marion come out And it ends with Marion asking, "What do you have to say to us?" And that's where it ends. We don't know what happens. We don't know what, the husband says to them. We don't know if Marion forgives. I'm thinking she doesn't. I'm thinking that she does not forgive, no matter what he says, because that's just the tone of what I feel is happening. But yeah, I super love it. And I love that we don't know. You just have to draw your own conclusions. That's pretty cool. So, with that, thank you all so much for being here. I love it when we can hang out. Super appreciate all of you. If you weren't here, it would just be weird and I would just be in the room talking to myself. So that's kind of cool that you're here too. We will be doing another one. Um, yeah. If I don't see you next time, I hope to see you very soon. As always, whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1000% appreciate you. And I 1000% appreciate your support. Goodbye.